Hi everyone and welcome to the Newsagent podcast. I'm Susie Lysett, Senior Content Executive at Goodlord, and this episode is a recording of our webinar on how the cost of living crisis will affect rent arrears and possessions. Paul Shamplina, Chief Commercial Officer at Hamilton Fraser and founder of Landlord Action, joined the session with Goodlord's Sherlock. In the recording, they share some top tips on how to support your tenants, how to protect your landlords, and how to safeguard your business during this time. The webinar itself is CPD accredited, so to get your certificate of attendance for that, you can still watch the session on demand on the Newsagent site. I'll include the link in the show notes and links to other resources you might find useful on the webinar topic as well. So that's all the housekeeping out of the way. On with the podcast.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this instalment of the Goodlord webinar service. Today, we're going to be discussing the cost of living crisis and how that's going to impact arrears and possessions. We are joined by the ever-interesting Paul Shamplina. He'll be joining us briefly to discuss all things arrears, possessions, and how they're going to be affected by the cost of living crisis. Before we get into the detail around that, a brief mention in terms of what Goodlord actually does. For those of you who don't know, we're a pre-tenancy platform that streamlines your entire lettings process and makes it more efficient and opens up new revenue streams. Probably a very interesting area of the industry at the moment, actually, in terms of some of the challenges we're facing, which I think, Paul, is fair to say we're going to discuss at some length today. More around the challenges, less so about Goodlord. This is not a Goodlord pitch. This is hopefully consultative to help agents out there sort of get around some of the challenges and master some of the challenges that the industry is throwing at them. So without further ado, Mr. Paul Shamplina, good morning.
Good morning, Ollie. How are you, mate?
I'm very good. We were talking off air about the big game tonight. We're both avid Spurs fans, so there's our attention for this hour hopefully is on this subject, but I presume for the rest of the day it might be the big game.
It's this hour is all about the cost of living and how it is going to affect the letting agents themselves that are watching this, as well as obviously their landlords and tenants. But it's and after that, it's focus on White Hart Lane later. So we've got a big game. But anyway, it's not a football webinar. It's it's an educational webinar.
Maybe we should branch off. I don't know. We'll see how it goes. Paul, I can't believe for a second there's many who don't know who Mr. Paul Shamplina is. But for those who don't, can you just give us a summary of what you do on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I'll just give you a quick background about me. So look, I've been helping landlords and letting agents for 30 years, literally. I mean, I've just been doing it forever, really. I started Landlord Action in 1999-2000 because I was fed up with lawyers charging too much money. And we're one of the leading landlord and tenant solicitors in the country. We're now up to, believe it or not, Ollie, up to 18 staff just in Landlord Action alone. We've got two more available job posts that we're looking for, and we are busier than ever. And obviously, we'll touch on that a little bit later on. We're really busy, but obviously, my role is I'm Chief Commercial Officer at Hamilton Fraser. Hamilton Fraser bought my company Landlord Action in 2017, so we also own at Hamilton Fraser My Deposits, Property Redress Team, Client Money Protect, Total Landlord Insurance, Landlord Zone, HF Assist, Ohm, and obviously Landlord. We got 10 or 12 different brands. So my job is I oversee sales for the whole group. So I don't just knock on doors and evict tenants where people might have seen that on obviously Nightmare Tenant Slum Landlords. I've done 6 series of that. It's very much part of being a bigger corporate company, really. But people don't really understand.
No, definitely. And that's exactly why I've invited Paul onto the webinar today, because we're interested to understand Paul's views, coupled with some views that we're obtaining through our insights to the market of how the cost of living crisis are going to affect arrears and possessions. I think in order to have a meaningful conversation around that, Paul, it's good for us to understand exactly where we stand today, because I think one view, given that the pandemic is seemingly behind us, we're back to relative normality. We're in the pub. We have to wear masks all the time. But in actual fact, the reality is that the effect of the pandemic is still very much front and centre of arrears and possession cases, isn't it? In terms of the volume and the lag. So talk us through where we are at the moment.
I'll tell you. I mean, look, I've been doing this my working life. I issued my first possession claim in 1991 when I worked for solicitors. So I am old, right? Feel a bit old, but literally, I can tell you now, since running Landlord Action, 22 years, we're the business we've ever been. period. I mean, last week we had in one day, I think it was 25 new cases, which is a hell of a lot in one day. And that those cases, half our work comes from letting agents and half come directly from landlords. So we've got 12 solicitors and paralegals. It's all fixed fees. We're a regulated firm of solicitors. And now issuing a claim, serving a notice, it's harder than ever before with all the rules and regulations that came in during the COVID 2020 Act. But the reality is, and I can give you some possession numbers because I'm up to date with everything. I mean, in 2020, there was something like the best part of about 40,000 possession claims that were issued. But the first quarter of 2020 was before lockdown. Last year, there was 30,000 possession claims. In 2019, there was 110,000 possession claims. The reality is, for 2 years, landlords weren't really issuing claims. And also the social housing sector weren't issuing possession claims. Now it's all kicked off. And I've predicted, and I've said this openly, you're going to be looking at 80 to 90,000 possession claims plus for 2022. The first quarter was really busy, and literally it's really busy. And also we've got a debt recovery department that's busier than ever now before because rent arrears are higher. Landlords are not writing them off, and they want to obtain a money judgment against their tenants. So it shows up in the credit referencing that you do at Goodlord.
And with the lag in mind, the latest Ministry of Justice stats suggested that the timeline from starting that process to actually getting the property back could be as high as 17.6 months. I think it was on one of the last.
Yeah,
I mean, that's a little misleading, isn't it? Because that takes into account.
It is misleading. Look, during the midst of the pandemic, we had horrendous cases, and I was doing loads of stuff in the press. If your case was stuck in the court system when the ban came in, which was March to September 2020, you were the worst affected. We had we regularly had rent arrears over 30, 40, 50, 60,000 pounds regularly, 12 months rent arrears. And actually it was taking 14 to 16 months to evict a tenant because you had 6-month notice periods. Obviously from the 1st of October, they went back down to 14 days and 2 months. And then obviously, the Renters Reform Bill, there's also a lot of unintended consequences with regard to Section 21 being banned. And obviously we can talk about that on another webinar, obviously, and what the impact of that's going to be. But basically, some courts are up to date, some courts aren't. Some courts have got a real lack of bailiffs, which is an issue as well. So and then, of course, they've now pulled part of the procedure where you used to have review hearings. That was a complete waste of time. It was about slowing everything up during the midst of a pandemic where there was no vaccine and they didn't want to mix and a big avalanche of evictions and people being homeless on the streets and not having a vaccine for a pandemic. So quite rightly, there should have been suspension. And now you will see 2022 ramp up with regard to possessions. And of course, taking into effect what we're going to be talking about today, the cost of living, all the bills going up.
Well, that's it. And I think, the way we're going to try and do this for those who are viewing is we're going to have the conversation on the cost of living crisis. Then we're going to go through 3 different points, and talk about how you can support your tenants as a letting agent, how you can protect your landlords as a letting agent, and how to safeguard your business. But given everything you've said there, Paul, the summary really, I suppose, is ultimately it's still extremely busy. This is a knock-on effect from the pandemic and from ultimately landlords and tenants, feeling the effect of things that have happened in the last couple of years. As you rightly say, that doesn't then take into account the cost of living crisis itself, which we are all affected by. I had my direct debit confirmation through from EDF only a couple of days ago, and the fact that my gas and electricity bill is doubled is just.
I know. I just had a recent letter yesterday. My mortgage has gone up. It's gone up. Obviously, we're up 1%. I mean, can I just throw some stats at you, just on the reality of what's going to happen? Because I think this is really important to say. Look, the average wage increase, if you're lucky enough to get a wage increase from your employers, is about 4%, 3 to 4%. The annual rate of inflation is about 8.3%. It's the highest it's been since the 1980s. Right, wages aren't keeping up with inflation, and that's obviously after 2 years of a pandemic, where obviously the government were supporting people with furlough and universal credit and bounce back loans. But there was a recent survey, and supposedly 2 million adults can't afford to feed themselves on a daily basis and struggle to feed themselves. I mean, that is quite shocking. The confidence of household finance is at an all-time low, is the reality. So you've got obviously the fuel, you've got the energy, and obviously the war in Ukraine certainly doesn't help that. You've got the interest rises. Now, bearing in mind, we're only at 1%. 1%, yeah? And I am ugly enough and old enough to remember in 88, 90, when I used to do house repossessions, when I used to work at in Brighton Chemical, the interest rate was 14, 15%. So if you speak to someone of a generation or two below me, they think that you're talking gibberish. Now, we're at 1%, and the interest rate, if it keeps on going up, is going to have a really, really big impact, even still at a real low percent, because people have been borrowing and having cheap money for a long, long time.
Sure. And with that change and with the pressure on tenants, there's an easy assumption, isn't there, that automatically escalate into an increase in arrears and increase in possessions. I think that's a fair assumption. I think we will see more tenants go into financial difficulty
and increase in rents.
And that's the other side. The market isn't actually playing ball with the idea that tenants are going to struggle because rents are rising. We're seeing more possession cases than arguably ever before, where landlords are wanting their properties back to then either sell the property or indeed re-let the property at a higher amount. So how do agents factor that in? And we're going to come on to this in some way, but I'm interested in your thoughts on how a letting agent should look at that, because, as an agent, I have a commercial obligation and duty of care to my landlord. They are my client.
Yes.
But I also recognise that tenant continuity and affordability and these things are important. So where in your mind is that balance for agents at the moment? It's pretty hard.
Yeah, of course it is. And there is, you've named a lot of different factors that are happening. Yes, there's a shortage of stock. More landlords are selling. The biggest challenge in the landlording world will be the EPC changes. Think about banning Section 21, which I've always said was a massive challenge. The EPC, there's landlords that are going to be exiting, cashing out, older landlords that have made hay while the sun shines. I think that, yes, of course, referencing is more imperative than ever before, getting guarantors, getting rent guarantee insurance, get all that. But the rents are going up. I spoke to one leading London landlord agent, and they have an average 11 applicants to one property. And I'm sure with the 400 plus agents that are on here, everyone's going to say they've got a lack of stock. I think there's a duty of care to the landlord. I think as agents, you need to be really transparent with that referencing, saying, being realistic with rent. So, yeah, you might have rent reviews and they might be going up every 2-3 years or whatever it may be. But actually, the reality is me as a landlord, I'm instructing you as an agent, Ollie. I know that the demand is strong. I want to see that there's 4 or 5 tenants going for the property. Who is my best bet with regard to paying that credit agreement for the next 12 months? That couple, that professional couple, the stability of the job. And you've also got to realise one thing that we haven't even talked about. Is there's almost 1.2 million job vacancies out there. Employers are struggling to get staff.
Yeah. The
way that staff work nowadays, and obviously working remotely and hybrid, has completely changed the world. So it's really, being in COVID was really weird economy-wise, but now coming out of it, there's all these different factors. So I think as an agent, I would say, right, I've got these 4 or 5 tenants. In my view, because I'm thinking about your interest, Mr. Landlord, because I want your property for the length of you being a landlord, not this tenancy. I think that Mary and John are your best bet out of these, and I'll tell you why. Boom, 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 boom. And I think that's really important. So I think there is going to be competition for properties, and I think as a tenant, as a letting agent, you need to put your credit cap on and actually say, right, this is your best bet, and this is why I think it's your best bet. Because, of course, you have to predict that, bills are going to be going up, and what is their disposable income if there is going to be rises with regard to the things that we talk about.
So, and I suppose that lends itself to saying, well, whereas before you might have found one tenant who, falls in the reference criteria, meets that threshold, it's potentially proactive, especially given the demand versus supply, to look at 2 or 3 tenants on that basis. And even if you're not putting them through referencing, getting a view of their initial application to then look at them side by side to then choose who to go through. And then you've got two or three other parties to fall back on. That's probably a common practice that's happening already, but more important now to have a view. I wonder how helpful some of the conversations that are being had around how to solve the thing we're talking about here are, because I think only in the last week, the Mayor of London has urged the government to essentially apply I think it was a 2-year rent freeze across London. And I'm wary that a lot of our viewers here are not based in London. We're a business that serves the UK, but often what happens in London ripples out. That kind of statement, whilst clearly is there to help tenants, actually, does that not then put some impetus behind landlords then saying, well, actually, my chance is now to increase the rent? So we're causing almost pressure at the top of the funnel by trying to sort of manage the problem with quite a blunt instrument. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, look, not every landlord puts their rents up, and if landlords do put their rents up, they might put them up every few years, They don't do it automatically. If it was index and inflation led, then landlords would be getting more rent, obviously, with regard to it. Look, the reality is that we have part of the government's initiative is levelling up, right? There was obviously a Queen's speech, and there's talk about the Renters Reform Bill and what's happening, and a lot of the levelling up is bed into that. Now, in Scotland, rent caps are definitely coming in. I sat next to one of the housing ministers. I put an event on for My Deposits in Glasgow. It's looking like in Wales, and there's more regulation in Wales and in Scotland. I think with regard to is there going to be rent caps? I think something could come in the future, horizon-wise. I understand why the Mayor of London has said about a rent freeze. I get that. Yeah. I really get that. But I think you've got to. I mean, I think the biggest bugbear that a landlord has about a letting agent is when a letting agent turns around and says, "I can get you X amount," and it's not achievable because they just want to take on. They want to pick up the instruction. So I think it's about being reality. I'd rather charge a tenant 25 quid or 50 quid less a week and make sure that I pick that tenant rather than that tenant picks me.
And there's tenant continuity there, and that's ultimately you look at landlord costs from a landlord.
It's about longevity. Having that tenant as long as possible.
Yeah,
that is the key.
And tenure is increasing year on year, and the pandemic's played a significant part in that. But it was already increasing pre-pandemic too. So actually, owing to the fact that you want tenants in there longer term, consistency, looking after the property well, etc. There's a question in from Michael Watson. Good morning, Michael. What are your thoughts on these guarantor inverted companies? One of which is offering to be a guarantor to unemployed tenants.
Yeah. So, I wouldn't touch that. Sorry, I'm Mr. Cynical. Being guarantor to unemployed tenants. I mean, what's the reality? What's that? You do claims and whatever. Yeah. Getting rent, doing a rent guarantee policy, or being a guarantor for someone who's not working, it won't work. So you stay well clear. There are some good companies out there like Housing Hand that do guarantors that are funded, which makes sense. I mean, and then obviously there's looking at guarantors that are homeowners, which is really important. And then obviously having that underpinned by rent guarantee policy, which yes, they've gone up in value, but I think it is a complete and utter no-brainer. I mean, we do legal work for rental guarantee insurance companies as well. So I mean, look, if you're talking about unemployed, you're talking about universal credit. The problem is also there's so many different factors coming in. With regard to universal credit, there was 6 million people on it during the midst of the pandemic. What happens is, depending on that stock and you've got, is that actually the less vulnerable and people on the lower income are going to suffer, because what's going to happen is, because demand is so strong, depending on the area you're at, if you're going to have a professional couple go for that property and you've got a cap on your universal credit or your LHA, and you can get another £200-300 a month from a private couple, you're going to go with that. And then there's a worry about, are you going to get the direct payment from universal credit? And landlords worry about that. So I think that there's going to be a real knock-on effect, and you will see even worse temporary housing and social housing crisis that's going to continue to grow, because the PRS is that sticking plaster.
And this is where, and I think that's a really good point. We've spoken about this actually, I think, together before multiple times in the last couple of years through this series of webinars where, the realisation should be from a governmental perspective that the PRS actually has propped up a housing crisis for a long, long time. The direction of travel, given the cost of living crisis, surely only makes the gap between the tenants who can and the tenants who struggle to even bigger. And, to Michael's point around essentially trying to put a plaster over somebody that seems by all definition not to be able to afford the rent, that's just a game that landlords, they don't even need to entertain it because the amount of tenants versus the one property available is so large at the moment.
Correct.
That actually, it's the people at the bottom of that chain that are going to really suffer. And that creates a real housing problem for tenants in unfortunate positions that maybe can't. And
it will get worse, Ollie, when Section 21 is banned as well for the less vulnerable. They will struggle even more because referencing is going to tighten up. And then the unintended consequence as well, and I know we're deviating a little bit, but I'll just say this point, which people don't realise, is that when tenants are being evicted under Section 21, there's no money order on that Section 21 order, so they can go to the council and be rehoused. But we did a survey on landlord zone, albeit it was a few years ago, and 40% of landlords were using Section 21 for rent arrears. When they switch to rent arrears, then it becomes a money order on the Section 8, and then if they go to the council say, well, hold on a second. You haven't paid the rent. You made yourself homeless. We can't help you. There's unintended consequences, which will have a knock-on effect with regard to low-income people.
100%, and we see that firsthand with our rent protection claims process in terms of you're looking for the mechanism to get the best result as streamlined as possible. And I think one of the things that tenants haven't factored in to how the existing legislation in place, but also how it's definitely going to change, that was confirmed in the last couple of days, is how much they're adding to their personal debt. They think, I think tenants believe in some circumstances, well, actually, the council advised me to stay here, nothing's going to happen. And actually, it can really, really sort of harm their ability over the next 6 years to find property, any lines of credit, etc. And the change of moving away from Section 21, as you rightly point out, I believe is that will only make that worse.
More landlords are enforcing money orders now. We've got two people just in our debt recovery department working full-time flat out because landlords just want to get, and even if they don't going to get their money, they just want to get a CCJ so it's marked.
Indeed.
They're doing it now because the debts are getting bigger.
Moya has asked a question. Good morning, Moya. Should referencing companies be adjusting their affordability requirements to reflect the current economic situation? Instead of having a tenant to earn 30 times the rent, should it be 32, 33, etc.? I'll probably take that one, Moya, given our position here at Goodlord. As part of our process, we reference tenants. It's something we're looking at, and I think it's something we need to understand really closely, because at the moment, up until now, 30 times has given enough fat, for want of a better word, in the affordability ratios to protect and give confidence to landlords and letting agents. That's not to say that should remain 30 times throughout the next 12 or 18 months. And I think it's a very fair question. One of the things I would stress from a referencing perspective that maybe agents don't have eyes on because they see the word pass or approved or tick, whatever your referencing company does, is look more closely at the affordability ratio. And I think being extremely explicit with landlords that ultimately, they have passed referencing. They have maybe passed, 32, they've maybe passed by 32 times, for example. And here's their earnings, but also here's where their liabilities are going to sit in the property. And that's exactly where I think things like rent protection come into play, because for all that you can be certain of at this moment in time, that tenant has all the means in order to live in that property consistently and pay their rent. However, having that other layer of protection there, I think is important. And, I don't want this to turn into a pitch around rent protection, but I would urge you, if you're not entertaining that product, it doesn't have to be through Goodlord. I would love it if it was. It doesn't have to be. Look into how that level of service can support your business, because given the uncertainty at the moment, it may be one of the most important auxiliary products out in the market as we currently speak. More questions coming in. One from Lorraine, I think, for you, Paul. What consideration has been given to Section 21 abolishment and managing student HMOs? What mechanism will landlords have to evict tenants in this scenario?
That's a good point. So what's happening now is, and you've had the tenant groups, especially Generation Rent, saying the Section 21 abolishment should happen now. To be fair to the government and the working groups, is they're taking their time on it because they need to make sure the mechanisms are in place, which means that you have to strengthen Section 8 grounds. You have to make sure they're mandatory. They've got to be updated. At the moment, there's 17 grounds. I think they go to about 24. I put forward a proposal that access should be a ground, not just going under ground 12, which is breach. So if you look at student lets, they're not obviously term time. Normally one would serve a Section 21 notice. I think what will happen is there will be a provision relating to student lets. We've already had that conversation. I was on a working group relating to that. So if there is a student and it is a student time, I believe that there will be a mechanism with a ground in Section 8 relating to students. What is a big issue, and why loads of landlords use Section 21, is antisocial behaviour, Ollie, which is a big issue. Big issue, because you go under Section 8, it's a discretionary ground, and then you have to get evidence from neighbours or other people in HMOs, and they're too scared, especially when there's been mental health and there's been violence. Now, we saw a massive increase of antisocial behaviour during lockdown, and I exposed it, and I had a few on the TV programme. So they need to, they'll be updating the grounds on antisocial behaviour so you can get court orders during terms of tenancy. But there will be, I believe that there will be a reference relating to student lets. And I mean, obviously, the two main one will be selling, moving back into the property, mandatory grounds, obviously Section 8. There'll be more, they need to be updated.
And the devil very much is in the detail there, because I think the one view, and we've talked about it already, as to where some of the more negative connotations of removal of Section 21 is. There is a positive side to the Renters Reform Bill if the government follow through on what they've said again this week. The government have confirmed again this week that they want to give landlords more powers where there is repeat rent arrears. And I would class repeat rent arrears as more than 1 month. And I'm very intrigued to see what action they take to give more substance and more power back to landlords where there is a breach of tenancy. And I wonder how accountable they'll be to that.
I don't know. I'm a little bit cynical, Ollie. I mean, look, the reality is, you ban Section 21, and obviously we've done a lot of work on the Lettings Industry Council. We did a white paper on it. Is mediation is going to form massively in part. I mean, obviously, as you know, you do a bit of mediation at Goodlord. We at the Property Redress Scheme, we've got a mediation business which we brought out during lockdown when it went to 6-month notice period. So we do mediation. Mediation will form part of the court process where you have to show you've tried to mediate. But it takes two to tango. If your tenant doesn't want to mediate, you can't mediate. You have to have a massive investment in the court system, which I believe that they've invested or said they're going to invest over 300 million. You need more bailiffs. You need to be able to transfer the case up to the High Court and use High Court enforcement officers. And you need to strengthen the grounds in Section 8. All those provisions need to be in place before you ban Section 21. And when you do ban Section 21, let's say that happens in 2 to 3 years, it will either happen in April or in October time, you will see a mass flurry of landlords serving Section 21s just to get it in before the banning time. Yeah. And then, under the Deregulation Act, which I was on, I came up with 2 ideas, which was, and they came into law, which was having a 6-month lifespan and serving after 4 months. What will happen is, bearing in mind, on the horizon, you've got the EPC changes coming in up to a level of C. So you will see, and I'm sure a lot of the agents that have attended today, they would have had landlords that are selling, and that will increase as well. So there's a lot of stuff on the horizon, but actually the reality is you'll see tenants staying longer. That's going to happen because they can't afford to move.
No, I get that. I think if we allow, and I say we as a collective, the industry, agents, I think we play an important part as suppliers to support agents. And I strongly believe, as I know you do, Paul, you do multiple events around supporting letting agents and the value that letting agents bring. I think collectively, if we allow the side note of the Renters Reform Bill in the sense of saying we're here to also help where things go wrong, if we allow that just to peter away, then the denigration on the overall strength of being a landlord is extremely challenged. Like you start questioning, why am I doing this? What actual power do I have? And I've not forgotten that line in the Renters Reform Bill where it says we're going to give you more powers. And I whilst I appreciate you're a relative cynic to that, I think it would be grossly unjust if they come out and say that and then do not deliver on that, because you really are stripping back a landlord's ability to control their property if it were to not be included, aren't you?
Yeah, you are. I mean, the reality is, I deal with really, really big landlords, corporate landlords. I'm part of lots of different organisations, and I was part of an organisation where you've got to have over 100 properties to be in this organisation, and we've got about 35 members in this organisation. It's called Plan, and every single one of them, the members, are all scaling up. They all want to add to their portfolio. You know. The ones and the two landlords, they are questioning, they are looking at themselves. And also, this is a really good opportunity. This time is a really good opportunity. And as you know, I do lots of training with letting agents. I was in Hull on Tuesday. I was doing a talk for East Riding Council. There was 120 landlords in the room. One landlord came up to me. He's got 30 odd properties in Hull. He's been a landlord for 25 years. He goes, I don't want to sell yet, but what I am going to do is I want to switch to full management with an agent. It's too difficult now. So actually, this is an opportunity for agents to find bigger landlords, to pitch to bigger landlords, to actually say to them, we'll take over your full management. And there's a lot of landlords that are looking to switch to agents, but finding the right agent for a landlord is a big, big move, and it's a big decision. And there's a lot of landlords out there, big landlords out there, that do have a lack of confidence in agents as well. So agents need to really come to the fore, but there is opportunities there.
No, clearly. And we've spoken before, and actually I think it was a Hamilton Fraser report that suggested something like 65% of landlords don't use a letting agency service. So the majority of the PRS are self-managed. And, that, I think that's got to be front of mind for agents because, when you think about the amount of competition you've got, I think the last Companies House report was something like there's 5,000 new estate and letting agents. Now, I know they're not all new, but the point is it's growing, and the segmentation of stock available at the moment is shrinking. Yes. That does create a bit of a perfect storm. But when you start to think, when you start to think that there is 65% of this opportunity sits outside of our world, it's about how do we tap into that world, not necessarily how do you win the property off your latest competitor. Most
definitely, and we write about it all the time. I run Landlord Zone. We've got 133,000 landlord members. Landlord redress is coming in. As you know, we're very heavily involved in it at the PRS. We've done a pilot scheme with the NRLA. We're getting the PRS. We have over 300 agents joining us a month, right? So some of them could be property sources. We do property education. Some of them could be estate agents. But as a whole, we have 300 agents, of which the vast majority of them are doing lettings, really small guys. The biggest challenge out there for any agent is, one, obviously keeping up with compliance and keeping up to speed and standing out from your competition, but is actually finding landlords. They don't grow on trees. You've got to hunt them down.
No, indeed. And where we've got questions coming through. So I was going to run through a few of them, if I may. Karen asks, is that 30 times the weekly rent? We do 2.5 times. 30 times the monthly rent, and it's the same maths, actually, as 2.5 times. So feels like, Karen, you're aligned there. Somebody with no name. Should there be a register for tenants who are serious defaulters? There's going to be a landlord register.
So I talk about this all the time. So I've talked about this for years. I've sat on government panels. I sat on the government panel when we brought in a rogue letting agent list and a rogue landlord list. And at the time, I criticised them because they only gave local authorities access, not even the consumer, to find out a landlord or a tenant, to find out about the agent. And of course, while I was at that meeting, I'm going back to 2014, 15, right?
Okay.
And I said, what about a serial bad tenant database? It would never, ever happen. It happens in Australia. It won't ever happen here because it would create more homelessness and more people not being able to get in. The only way you look at it, and the advice I give to you as letting agents, to your landlords, is if you get a money order, get a county court judgment, enforce it. Your money order in Section 8 is not a county court judgment. It's only a county court judgment when you enforce it. I mean, that's why we introduce fixed fees. So we get landlords thinking, I'm never going to get any money back. I'm going to get an attachment of earning against the tenant's wages. I know I've seen on LinkedIn that they're working X amount. I'm going to get £40 a month. I don't care. It's only cost me £700 to do, but that is a county court judgment. And a lot of tenants eventually will aspire, if they can, to try and be a homeowner. And if that's the case, They have to settle your judgment. So that's the only way you create a bad tenant database, is enforcing a money order.
Yeah, and it's worth adding that, companies like Goodlord and in positions of referencing, and in positions of managing rent protection policies and claims, we circulate that information through the businesses, but that's a siloed approach. Until there would be a big data share, as Paul says, that's just not really on the horizon. But the point you make there, Paul, about executing that process, I think is the most important one, because then the credit file is the source of truth. There will be thousands and thousands of tenants, though, that have not been taken to that stage, and it never shows up.
And I think also what has to happen, and obviously open banking is changing this, Ollie, and obviously, you run referencing, and obviously we do referencing a bit here, just albeit on a very tiny scale for the direct landlord market, is actually, surely it must be a good thing. Look, 95% of tenants out there are great, they're brilliant. Yeah, you get a few disputes, but, they're paying the rent on time, this, that, whatever. Surely if a tenant is paying the rent on time, just like you're paying your Barclays card, Ollie, that builds up your credit rating because you're a good payer. And actually it should be deemed as the same. So I think it should be promoted in a positive way, because obviously, at the moment, everything's a bit archaic, because I'll write to your previous landlord, Ollie, and ask for a good reference. And a lot of the time it's untruthful, because you could be a bad tenant, but I'm giving you a good reference because I want to get rid of you at my property, and I don't want to have to wait 6, 8, 10 months to evict you. And that happens a lot as well. The previous landlord's reference is sometimes not reliable.
We'll be right back after this message.
Do you want to stop wasting time on admin and jumping between different platforms to get just one job done? Do you want to focus on your agency's business goals instead? From automated offer letters and e-signing to online referencing and even rent collection, Goodlord can help your agency get rid of the admin-heavy parts of your lettings job in one integrated platform, so you can refocus on your business and your customers. Head to goodlord.co today to learn more. Goodlord, it's just that good.
We have a few more questions. I'm just going to come back to those briefly. I just want to take us through some of the finer points in terms of how we can support tenants and landlords and your businesses. And we've covered most of this, so we'll fly through this. Now, I'm appreciative of people's time this morning. Everybody's extremely busy. So thank you very much for everybody joining us this morning, and indeed those who are listening in after the event. But in terms of how you can support tenants, we've listed a few things here. We've covered more in actually that pre-conversation, but utilising referencing and understanding the tenant's financial situation. I mean, that should go without saying. If anybody is out there not referencing tenants or ultimately looking for confirmation from the tenant themselves and not doing a comprehensive reference check, then I dare say
it's like Russian roulette. It's Russian roulette, Ollie.
You're asking for trouble. I think communication from a tenant perspective is really important too. And often we see, especially when we're mediating, the view of the tenant is it's big bad letting agent and big bad landlord. Not being that self-reflective on the fact you've not paid the rent for 2 months, which is interesting. But ultimately, the time to solve problems is before the problem occurs. Once that problem occurs, like arrears, for example, often tenants put their heads in the sand, the drawbridges come up, and it's good night Vienna. So in terms of communication, checking in with your tenants. How many times do you communicate with them on a monthly basis? Do you send them newsletters? Do you send them offers for support and advice, direct them to different places for information that may be helpful through this period? It might feel like a waste of time, but if you can help 1 or 2 tenants understand that position to make an informed decision to say, listen, I'm really struggling. I can pay my rent for the next few months, but I'm looking to exit the property. You can take proactive action for your landlord and not turn that into a elongated claim where if you haven't got rent protection, mass arrears mount up and
be proactive. Yeah.
Exactly right. And the transparency of liabilities, I think, is important because, and I mean this from a tenant's perspective, when a tenant walks in the property, it's important they understand what the liability of doing that is. And it's not just the rental amount, of course. They have other liabilities like council tax. Gas and electricity bills at the moment might be akin to the actual rental amount itself. And bear in mind, the price cap is more than certainly going to go up again in October. This is going to be an elongated problem for tenants. So understanding what their overall liability for that given property is, hopefully that's a helpful step. And finally, from a tenant's perspective, helpful products and services. For example, we have a income and injury protection product that is offered to tenants. If they fall injured or ill, including mental health challenges, then ultimately they can get a up to £2,000 payment per month tax-free into their accounts, allowing them to pay their rent, their bills, etc. And that's one of many products out there that can be supporting tenants. So a few things there that maybe you can pick up on that maybe you're doing already, or maybe you're doing, in some respects. But hopefully that's helpful. From a landlord perspective, Paul, how would you, if you were a letting agent now, how would you go about protecting a landlord who's entering the market? You just won their property and they're looking to rent it out over the next 3 or 4 weeks. How would you be looking to protect a landlord at the moment?
Well, I think, look, I think you've got to, one thing is, if you've got a new landlord on board, is you need to showcase your expertise. You need to showcase honesty and transparency and realism with regards to the property and the property you're renting. But of course, being really robust with your referencing, explaining the referencing process to a landlord. Not enough letting agents do that. That does annoy me. Or they say, yeah, he's good, putting it through, because landlords need to be educated as well. It's really important. Explaining terms of the tenancies, what the tenant is liable for. And then, of course, offering them rent guarantee insurance does obviously make sense. So they're covered and they cover the legals. That makes sense. And obviously, and then, of course, above and beyond that is obviously, the full landlord insurance. So I think that makes sense. And then, of course, what type of tenant are you renting out to? Are you renting out to a student or a young couple or a universal credit tenant? So then, you need to be looking and pushing for guarantors. One thing that doesn't happen with agents, which does annoy me, and it really is getting a next of kin. Just small things. They're getting a next of kin. But the amount of times we do a case and we know nothing, the tenant's done a runner, we think they've done a runner, but we don't know if it's abandoned. So we're not sure about taking possession, or they've gone to prison or something's happened. But having regular comms with a third party on that tenancy makes sense, and bring that third party. Just it's really important. But more landlords, more corporate landlords now have implemented processes in their systems where they are having guarantors as part of the mechanism when renting out properties as well. As long as obviously more people taking rent guarantee insurance.
Yeah, so I suppose your point is doubling down on the process, making sure that there's an understanding that there is potentially more risk in the market at the moment, given world events and economic pressures, and actually there's some sensible steps we can take. And I suppose that's the fine balance, isn't it, for agents? And it's one I know, very well from a rent protection perspective that sometimes agents really struggle with, because they feel that they're almost saying, listen, there's going to be a problem. If you come to us, there's going to be a problem. And that's kind of the feedback we get from agents. But I think the delivery of that actually is important, because that shouldn't be the connotation. If a landlord's going into this process not understanding that there is an element of risk involved in renting a property, then they probably need to be educated. Would that be fair to say, Paul? Because there's always risk, isn't there?
Yeah, of course there's always risk. Look, you have a 6 or 12 month credit agreement. The reality is, you say to your landlords, look, prior to lockdown, the average term of a tenancy was 4 years and 3 months. And this is what agents have to do. As a landlord, I am a landlord. I want to know the agent is going to fight for me. I want to know that I'm not just a number in their portfolio. I want to know that they're going to look after my property. They're going to do midterm inspections. They're going to report to me. They're going to be transparent. I'm going to get paid the rent on time, which is really important. I also want to make sure that when I am speaking with my letting agent, or my letting agent is educating me, is actually saying, you know what, if there is a dispute, don't worry, we'll deal with it for you. So there's a deposit dispute, okay? Or if there's an issue with the tenancy, we'll deal with it. If we have to evict whatever, the agent's job in a fully managed process is a peace of mind. Give the landlord a peace of mind. And that is what you're doing here. The reason you're getting full management is the landlords don't want to deal with aggravation. They don't want to deal with a tenant, right? But actually, more importantly, and we you say aggravation, you say complaints, but the whole point of the levelling up now is the government have turned around and said, look, safer homes, protection, looking at capping and rents. Actually, the tenants are the customers, okay? And the customers deserve a better service. And now what they're doing is, well, if you don't use an agent, we're talking about VOPO, and that I think that's been kicked into long grass a little bit further down the line.
Yeah,
if you're a landlord doing it yourself, well, now you've got to be part of a redress scheme. Agents have to be. Why don't you?
Yeah, and that parity I think is important as well, because without that, there's not a level playing field, and you essentially start to circumnavigate parts of the more challenging areas that being an agent encounters. So I think having that kind of parity across landlords and agents is extremely important. And also bear in mind, like if this is about improving standards, letting agents are professionals at what they do. The idea that almost the market or the legislation doesn't sort of recognise that, I think, is somewhat frustrating, because the role a letting agent performs is far above just executing a tenancy agreement. The benefit to tenants, the benefit to landlords in terms of professional advice and guidance, I think, is massive. And I wonder if agents weren't there working as hard at understanding all of these changing parts as they do, where that would leave tenants and landlords, actually.
I mean, the reality is, Ollie, and we all know in the industry, letting agents are actually, with regard to their service they charge, are underpaid. For fully managed service, they spend hours and hours and hours fully managing a tenancy, from the pre-let application to at the end of the tenancy. Unfortunately, in my eyes, and I see it all the time, and that's why I do training to letting agents as well, on how to attract landlords to your business, is agents need to showcase what they do. So they've got terms of business. This is what I do for you. Bring it to life. Yes, we're going to protect you. Yes, we're going to make you compliant. Yes, we're going to do, and all that type of stuff. But I am seeing a shift of the older seasoned landlord now. If they're not getting out the market and they want to keep that portfolio for their kids and whatever, and their kids aren't in that business, they've built up a lot of property over time. I am seeing a shift now, from me speaking to landlords and some letting agent, when I go to letting agent events, is there are landlords that are looking to pass over those portfolios over.
Which is, like you said earlier, a good opportunity for those agents, hopefully. Let's talk about the agents and how agents can protect their business then. If we can move on a slide, please, Sarah. One of the suggestions on here is a financial health check. And I suppose what we mean by this is both of tenants and indeed of your own business. The cost of living crisis is going to affect not only your tenants, not only your landlords, but also you as individuals, as business owners, and indeed your staff. And understanding how you forecast to generate revenue over the course of the next 12 to 18 months, of course, is probably a process you go through yearly anyway by writing your budget. But the game has maybe changed somewhat in terms of stock and all the things we've talked about today. So understanding where those potential gaps are and how other services and products available in the market can give you a revenue source. A good example of this is a backbook process that we do with our agents. And it applies rent protection across the board to all of their active landlords. And it creates an instant revenue gain. There's other things you can do, but actually, arguably, none as big a needle mover as a backbook process for rent protection at the moment, again, with it being topical for landlords. So things like that, just understanding how and what the market can deliver to you as an agent to help support that financial aspiration you have. Because, arguably, winning properties, as we've said, is going to be tough. And maybe even more reason, Paul, to go on your courses, because I know, as you said, you talk through how they can do that.
Shall I just tell you that web? I mean, if people want to take a note, the website is paulshamplina.tv. So I do obviously letting agent training, how to pitch. I actually go in their office. I love it. I do some mystery shopping. I get on the phone. I come in it from a real landlord's perspective. What a landlord wants to hear. I mean, there's 3 common questions a landlord will ask an agent: how much do you charge? How quickly can you rent it? Effectively. But I also I'm seeing now lots more agents now, because after it are putting on landlord events, free landlord events. So I go in, I do the chat and the speak. I train corporate landlords up. So if people want more information to book me personally, it's paulshamplina.tv.
Fantastic. We've got a few more questions in. I feel like we've covered products and services already. I don't want to harp on about that. I think it's quite clear that there's things out there that can help businesses. And we've talked about advice and actually affordability ratios already in the session. So let's cover the questions. I'm mindful again of people's time. We've got a question in from, we've had that one, Lorraine. I don't think we have got this. Lorraine asks, what would you recommend for landlords who have long-term existing tenants where the property is now aged, as tenant doesn't want to be interrupted for works, rent is below market rate, the EPC rating is below C, and Section 21 abolishment is likely? Is there a perfect storm brewing?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really, really good point. You know what? All landlords out there, and I said this on Tuesday to 120 landlords, and this is the time when they have to be professional, think professional, and every landlord's on a different journey. They have to business plan. So what I'm saying to you is if you've got a landlord with a portfolio, they have to see how their portfolio is performing. You know, what rents are lower than others? How much money have they effectively been losing because they can't get that market rent? So it's a bit of a catch-22 because depending on the type of landlord, the type of personality, the type of relationship they have with the tenant, because don't forget, landlords and tenants on the whole have really good relationships. And actually, just on this point, just reminded me, I'm doing a whole campaign on Landlord Zone, on good landlord stories. I'm going to bring it to life. I'm going to bring the whole industry together. So watch that space. I'm doing that with Nigel Lewis. It depends on that property, because you've also got to think that on some of those scenarios is landlords don't want to refurb and they want to sell them because they want to cash in. So, you know, what it is a perfect storm, and there will be landlords that are thinking, right, oh my God, Section 21's going. You know what, this could be my last chance, you know, because there is going to be grounds under Section 8, but landlords don't know how that's going to work, because when you talk about Section 8 to agents and landlords, they get really intimidated by it because it's a hearing and they don't know what to do. So I think it could be a perfect storm brewing, and I think what Lorraine says, and you will see landlords that are whacking in those Section 21s, want to get vacant possession, want to do the property up, want to put the rents up and then try and find another tenant. That's definitely going to happen.
I think again it goes
but
back to the point.
But of course, just on that last point, unintended consequence, where tenant groups don't understand. So the abolishment of Section 21, EPC rises. What happens? Good tenants that have been in the property 3, 6, 7, 8 years, all of a sudden are going to be evicted. And then they're going to have to try and find another property. They're going to have removal costs. They're going to have to pay rents. There's a massive unintended consequence that people and civil servants, political people and you know, commentators, they don't understand the practicality, but we do for people that are on the ground.
Indeed, and it's that domino effect that I think suggests that from the rents reform bill aspect, especially, the devil is very, very much in the detail, and understanding how the mechanisms are changing is going to be crucial to allowing agents to support landlords proactively. Because of course, you know, if you've got an existing stock, you've got this affects all of your customers from the moment it goes live. More questions in. Ricky, good morning, Ricky. I hope you're well. Listening as an agent in Wales, taking this morning's topic into account, Paul, how do you see the pending July changes relating to the Rent Home Wales Act affecting the process of gaining vacant possession, taking into account the 6-month notice period, minimum 12-month tenancies, and the end of our Section 21s?
That's Ricky Purdy. Nice to see you, Ricky.
It is Ricky Purdy.
Yeah. I know Ricky well from Dawson's. I mean, it's going to be tougher. You know, tougher for the guys in Wales. You know, they're going to go to occupational tenancies. It's about, you know, the whole point of all this and everything that's happening, Scotland, Wales, England, is about the tenants having greater security. It's about making sure that there's this myth that landlords and letting agents are serving Section 21s on a whim, because they want to evict a tenant because there's non-fault. There's always a fault, always a reason. So the reality is, Ricky, it's going to get more difficult. You're going to get a lot of disheartened landlords in Wales. I speak to them quite regularly. I'm doing a talk there next month, actually. It's going to take longer. It's going to be harder, is the reality. Will that have an impact of landlords in Wales exiting? You know what? This is a long-term game, and the professionals that want to scale up on their portfolios are factoring this in, and they are scaling up, where the smaller landlords are looking, I'm not saying all, but there are, you know, there's going to be, and it will open up opportunity for investors as well.
And agents alike, because, you know, ultimately, as the more complex the systems and legislation becomes, the more advice that landlords need, and actually that's where agents can step into. Indeed. Second part of Ricky's question is around the rent protection policy. Ollie, how do you see rent protection insurance policies and offerings being affected come 2023? We don't necessarily see them being affected. I think they become more important, and I think it's important to ensure that we recognise the change in process and legislation, and that ensure that's covered as part of the policy, which is certainly the intention at the moment. BAU, I think, is the message there, Ricky. But would welcome your thoughts on how how you see our proposition changing in Wales to reflect maybe a change in landlord needs or lack of confidence?
I think letting fees will go up as well in Wales naturally.
Well, you're doing more for your money, arguably. There's more things to consider, and again, that's a whole different webinar on how agents value fees, because I know, Paul, you and I have strong feelings of being extremely supportive around agents undervaluing themselves, despite a competitive market. But we'll do that as a second instalment. Nick Addison, good morning, Nick. I'm seeing more and more tenants requesting that their tenancy falls periodic. Is this wise for the landlord, Paul?
That's a good point, really. I think at the end of the day, the landlord is calling the tunes with regard to the tenancy. It is supply and demand, okay? So I think landlords are quite within their right to have some... Tenants want security. Why can't landlords have security? If I've got a tenant, depending on what that landlord's circumstances are, don't forget there's so many different landlords at different stages in their career, and some landlords want to move back in or they want to sell, whatever. And I think that if you've got a tenant and it's been month to month and a landlord wants to plan, I think it's very reasonable to say, well, I want to re-sign another year's tenancy, quite rightly. If the tenant doesn't want to do that, well, then the landlord, because this is a professional call that they have to give, is they have to think, well, do I carry on? It could be another periodic for another year. I'm quite relaxed with that, which a lot of landlords are. Or do I think, you know what? I need a bit of security. I need to budget. I need to plan. Though I think let's have some sort of consent. You should leave if you don't want. And you could call the tenant's bluff in that sense as well, because there's plenty of tenants knocking the door that want to rent this property. And I think that for a letting agent and a landlord is a really bit of strong advantage as such, that they can say to a tenant in that situation.
Agreed. This isn't a charitable process. Like, landlords have their own costs, and one of the things that often the likes of Shelter and the media forget is that most landlords are single property owners, investment wise. They're not driving around in Bentleys, and they have costs to pay. And
just on that point, sorry, I'm going to be a bit controversial because I think you saw it as well. Did you see the latest video that Shelter put out about letting agents?
I did. Yeah.
I commented on it, quite strong words and stuff, where they were basically, it was a take on a Mickey take of letting agents saying, why don't you rent this property with full mould and that? And it's that's what Shelter do. It's the shock factor.
Yeah, and I think clearly shows they don't actually understand what the industry does and how it works. So correct. I think I'm almost annoyed the amount of attention it got, because
that's the whole point. That's the modus operandi.
It
it's to get attention. It's to it's to raise the fundraising of that housing organisation, which doesn't actually house anyone. But that's not.
And the other thing it does, of course, it means that it forces you into one camp or another almost. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with an agent standing there going, I actually agree that tenants should have the best possible service and support they can. I also agree that landlords should have control and they should be able to benefit commercially from owning a property. The two things they don't have to be polar opposites. But the campaigns like that do that.
But also letting agents have got to be big and bold, right? Because you've also got to put a price on your portfolio and on your clients and on your time and on your staff's time. If you've got a landlord that's difficult, especially won't pay full management fees and it's calling up and is let only, and they won't want to pay for maintenance fees, which is maintenance charge, which is some of the biggest bugbears for a letting agent, and it's a troubled property in your portfolio, you've got to be big and bold enough to say, sorry, we don't act for you anymore. And agents need to do that more.
No, definitely. I appreciate we're running out of time. A quick point from Karen there. Are we the conversation on periodic tenancy? The situation will be very different if there's no Section 21, which is a fair point. The mechanism there may well be challenged. Just going through the questions. Nick, follow-up question to your point around the periodic point we just talked about. Can you still renew rent protection for periodic tenancies? You can. The rent protection policy at Goodlord covers the property. It's applicable to any tenants moving in and out of that property during that term. Sophie makes a good point around mandating the next of kin details through the Goodlord process. I've already sent that feedback through to the wider team, Sophie. I think that's a fair point and sort of in line with Paul's point around trying to obtain and confirm this information. We've got a good opportunity as part of our platform to get all of that and get it.
So I've given you an idea to add to your referencing process.
I fear we should be doing that already, and we do, but we don't mandate it. it. And I think that there lies the problem. So no, very, very good shout, Sophie. Thank you very much. And I'm going to say it's Sophie's idea, Paul, not yours.
Well, no, I will say Sophie's idea because I haven't seen your mandated systems. Well done, Sophie, for flagging it.
Abigail says, it would be really useful to know what the process of getting a money judgment following Section 8 arrears and eviction process had completed.
Yes.
How could we educate ourselves and landlords on this process? I fear that's quite a long... There's quite a long answer to that. Can we have a short summary?
Right, a short summary. Right. So if anyone out there wants... I mean, we even collect, believe it or not, we collect renewal fees for agents. Right? We do a lot of those as well. So if you're owed any money or you get a money order on a Section 8... what happens is the $6 million question is the tenant still at the property if they left? They might have been evicted. You normally wait 3 to 6 months to do a trace. We do tracing. We have about 75% success rate. Once you've traced them, then you can enforce. So then the $6 million question is where the landlord comes back to the agent. What do we know about the tenant? Oh, we don't know. We left his job 18 months ago and we don't know anything. Most tenants don't have any assets. Most tenants are renting in fully furnished properties, thus they don't have any assets. But social media is amazing now because you can find so much out about a tenant. You know, you go on LinkedIn, you go on Instagram, all that type of stuff. So, you know, can we enforce it? And we could use a high court enforcement agent to go to their new address to try and collect. They get commission, okay? We could get an attachment of earnings where, again, whenever a money order is enforced, you know, sometimes we do we use a county court bailiff to try and enforce a money order while there's an eviction date set down at that property while they're there. Bailiffs will never collect the money, but once it's enforced, it becomes a county court judgment and it's registered at the Registry of County Court Judgments. There's charging orders, there's bankruptcy. If you go on our website, landlordaction.co.uk, click on debt recovery, there's a whole list of items that you can do. You can get a third party order, you know, or where the tenant goes to court, or you get a garnishee order where if you've got they've got money in their bank account, you can get an order that money comes out. There's a whole list of things. But every case is different. So we have to think, well, what's the best likelihood we can try and collect the money against that tenant?
Thank you very much, Paul. We have definitely run over and definitely run out of time. Apologies. I think there's a couple of questions there that we've not had time to cover. If we want to have further conversations around any aspect of today's session, please feel free to reach out to myself or Paul or our wider businesses. Both sets of businesses are there to support you as letting agents through what we can clearly see is a potentially challenging time. I think both businesses offer some kind of resource that can really help solve some of those conundrums. Finally, thank you to you for your time, Paul, and thank you to all the viewers. We appreciate everybody's busy in an extremely busy market. So to take an hour out of your day is much appreciated. But Paul, thank you very much. Up the Spurs tonight.
Up the Spurs.
Hopefully we're going to win.
Please God.
And I look forward to speaking to you soon.